First things first, no, I haven't finished grading the papers. That's why it says no, I'm not done. I'm going to leave this up here for anyone who gets here late. You'll get them back by next Monday. Second business point is that I have a funeral I have to attend on Wednesday, which means that I'm not going to be able to post the extra video that I'm assigning that's on the syllabus. So what that means is I'll just cover anything that I don't get to talk about today in class. I will just run over and we will use the time after class to finish talking about the being sane in insane places. There's not that much I was going to talk about anyway. So if you want to hear about that now, stick around. Otherwise, wait till the YouTube video goes up later tonight. Lastly, as Jazid just reminded me, I forgot to post the YouTube video from the last one before break, so I'm going to post that tonight too. All right, any questions, comments, concerns, feelings? Hopefully you all had a decent enough spring break and are feeling mildly less burnt out, maybe like 1%. Maybe you got a little bit of relaxation. I saw human beings over break, and there were a lot of them, and I hadn't seen that many people, like friends and things, in such a long time that I think I forgot how to do it. And in some ways, I feel like it was even more exhausting than teaching. I like forgot how to be like small talk. What is that? I forgot what it is. So anyway, yeah. All right. So today's topic: what is a mental illness / mental disorder? That's all we're going to be talking about is what are these things? And the main lesson we're going to take away from today is that giving an answer to this question is much more difficult, complicated, and nuanced than in the case of a physical disease or physical ailment. So first off, I want to give a little public service announcement. I do not intend at any point today to be suggesting that mental illness and mental disorders are not real. I am somebody who I grew up with 2 psychologists for parents. I have been in therapy myself. These are things I believe are very much real. I do not mean to be dismissing anyone's suffering, anyone's experience. I think the distress of mental distress is just as dangerous and problematic as physical injuries and physical illnesses. It's just that when we start talking about them, what we find is it's a lot more complicated to give diagnoses. What it is we're diagnosing are much less clear cut. They're much harder to wrap your head around. And it's just, if you're going to understand, like if you suffer from mental illness or mental disorders, what is going on with you? Why is it so much harder to, give a diagnosis? This sort of stuff, to understand why this stuff is more complicated, you kind of have to understand what it is. So again, so I'm in no way trying to minimize or dismiss anyone's personal experience with your own mental struggles at any point in this. What I'm just going to be showing is some of the difficulties that have arisen and what some of the lessons are from those difficulties, and why some theorists have said things as extreme as there are no mental illnesses, there's just brain problems and things like that. So what exactly a mental illness is a very important sort of question, because if you are somebody getting treated for a mental illness, well, it's hard to treat something if you don't know what it is. So everyone on board with just this general background? We okay? All right, awesome. So the next thing I want to then do is let's go back to our concept unit. And in our concept unit, we said you can give a big, fancy, necessary, and sufficient definitions, or you can just come up with some examples of something to try to understand it. So for mental illness, mental disorders, instead of trying to come up off the bat with a big, fancy definition, let's just give some examples of what the sorts of things are that people are talking about when they're talking about mental illness. So what are things that we think of as mental illnesses or mental disorders?
Depression.
Depression, yeah. Depression. What else we got?
Schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia. I can never spell this word. There. That's how you spell schizophrenia. Schizophrenia. What are some other ones we have here? Oh, that's also how you spell depression.
Bipolar.
Bipolar is another one. Bipolar disorder. So we'll go back through once these are up on the board. We can just talk about what they are. PTSD is another one.
Bulimia.
Bulimia and other eating disorders. Bulimia. I can never spell bulimia either. I just can't spell disorders. I'm just gonna put anorexia under it. And
Dementia.
yeah.
Autism.
Dementia. Let's see what other ones. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Any other?
ADHD.
Wait, say that
ADHD.
ADHD. I think Avindra, did you have one?
Substance
Autism.
abuse.
Say that again.
Substance abuse.
Yeah, substance abuse or any sort of addiction or substance abuse. I'm gonna put addiction just because it covers. So let's just run down the line. Major depression disorder is what? Well, anyone who's taken an abnormal psych want to give the definition of depression. Very often depression gets confused with sadness, and in the medical mental health sense, they're not the same thing. Depression is generally a sort of, what's the best way of describing it? A major depressive episode is a sort of feeling, it's not even sadness, it's just like a numbness and a lack of meaning in the world and a very difficult time motivating. And it's generally in a classic case of it, it's not set off, it can be initially set off by a particular episode, but it's usually not just like sadness in response to a death of a loved one. It might start that way, but then it continues for a very long time and your motivational levels just really drop. Schizophrenia. What is schizophrenia? Anyone know? Basically, the definition of schizophrenia is it's someone with, there are various different flavors of it, but yeah, it's seeing or hearing things that aren't really there. It's delusions. Very often it's hearing voices in your head or seeing things out there in the world. Bipolar disorder is, A Beautiful Mind was based on that. There's a lot of movies around schizophrenia. Schizophrenia should not be confused with split personality disorder, which I'll also put up here, or multiple personality disorder. And that's one in which you have a case in which a single person almost has it's literally like two people are living inside that same person, and one of the people cannot know anything else the other person does. It's literally like one body, two separate minds in which their memories, their actions, their personality. Go for it, Daniel. Take your time and switch computers. So that's multiple personality disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar. Anyone know what bipolar is?
When your mood just changed from depressive to like almost like super exciting.
Yeah, and so a bipolar somewhat, so in like the same sense as the North Pole is the very top and the South Pole is the very bottom, someone with bipolar disorder has a tendency to swing from moments of extreme depression, like the sort of like you would kill yourself if you had the energy to do so, but you don't even have that energy level of depression, to crazy moments of mania in which you're just like convinced anything is possible, and very often it ends up with like no worries about the consequences because you're just so high on life. And those are like the most extreme versions, so these manic episodes. And of course, in all of these sorts of things, there are different levels. You can have lower level bipolar, but in an extreme case, it's clearest you have someone from extreme mania to levels of extreme depression and back and forth, and they kind of cycle. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is generally any sort of emotional distress caused by trauma. Classic cases are soldiers coming back from war who saw atrocities committed either to them or to other people in their unit. And usually it's signaled by just very difficult time reintegrating back into society. It often involves reliving moments of extreme trauma and just like it coloring your entire life. There are cases with PTSD of like soldiers in World War II who would come back from the war and then like have crazy dreams at night in which they were constantly being like charged by enemy soldiers and would wake up with their like hands around their wife's throat because they thought their wife was a soldier and almost killed them because they were reliving these moments. Anorexia and bulimia, eating disorders in which you have instead of eating food and consuming and leaving it down, anorexia is you don't eat. Bulimia is you eat large amounts but then vomit it up. Dementia is any type of losing of memory or mental function as you get older. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is there just certain like sorts of tics or behaviors that you are just you have such a strong compulsion to do that they get in the way of your everyday life. So these can be things like, and someone with OCD will be like, they will not leave until they've washed their hands, and then they'll get worried that they haven't washed their hands enough. So they'll just wash their hands until they're like bloody because they haven't convinced themselves their hands are clean yet. Or you can't do things like you just have little tics, like before you leave a room, you have to turn the lights on and off 7 times. And if you don't do that, it causes incredible distress. So it comes in different levels and everything else. Oh yeah, Gavindra says anxiety and phobias are another one. So yeah, let's put those up here. Anxiety, and then any sort of phobia. So ADHD is attention deficit hyperactive disorder. It's someone who has is unable to sit still to such a degree, and they just cannot stay focused on something, and their just attention jumps around. It's very often it can be tough to diagnose small children with ADHD because the line between someone who falls under ADHD and just being a small boy with too much energy can be unclear. Addiction is, well, it's addiction. It's just doing something to a degree that is harmful to you and not being able to stop. It can be gambling, it can be sex, it can be drugs, it can be video games, all of that. Anxiety, this isn't like the sort of anxiety you get in which like the line between just being like shy and social anxiety kind of blurry. But anxiety is generally, an anxiety disorder is when you are so incredibly stressed out by something that you can't function normally in that setting. So someone with like social anxiety, instead of just being nervous when they meet new people, they will literally like break down and cry and cannot leave their house and will have trouble breathing with a panic attack. Phobias is a deep, deep, deep fear of something that gets in the way of your everyday living. And very often the things you're afraid of are things that in some sense you know cannot hurt you, or you've been told it can't, and yet it will still cripple you. So if you have like a phobia of spiders, if you see a spider, you'll never want to be in that house again. You can never go back because you saw a spider. All right, so these are the general list of sorts of things. And there's many other sorts of things that get categorized as mental illnesses and mental disorders. So these are the sorts of things we're talking about, and there's major literatures on all of these, and there are people who specialize in them, lots of research. However, what we find is when we try to say what all of them have in common, or what makes them all disorders, or what it takes to count as a disorder, it gets a lot messier. Now, why is this the case? Why is it hard to do this? Well, this list here looks a lot like another list, a list of physical diseases or physical ailments. In the same way, a doctor might just have a list of other sorts of things. So, what are some physical diseases? We can put up things like COVID, measles, cancer. What else can I throw up here? Just of other sorts of illnesses or diseases in the physical realm. Just bodily diseases. I'm tired of thinking of them myself. Diabetes. Headaches. So I'm just going to put migraines because that covers it, or just any sort of persistent headache. Flu, asthma. So yeah. So at first glance, I can never asthma. Okay, so these are the things that we're looking at. So at first glance, you look at these two lists and they look the same. Things we call diseases that come in a list, And if you have one of them, you go to a trained professional to help you deal with it. But what's the key difference here? Why is it that it's harder to give a definition for mental disease than it is to give a definition for physical diseases? For each of these cases, what is it that they are doing? What is it to have COVID?
To have physical changes.
Yeah, there's a physical change, and then generally speaking, there are some symptoms that are caused by those physical changes. So for instance, with COVID, there are little tiny microscopic viruses in your body, and they're floating around in there. They get into your system and they start reproducing, and in the course of reproducing, they cause harmful effects to you, and it's unpleasant, and you do your best to fight it, and maybe you succeed, maybe you don't. But there's this divide here. You've got the symptoms versus the physical damage specifically to some sort of organ. So in COVID's case, it's like in the bloodstream, it'll often attack the lungs. Cancer, it depends on where the cancer is. But again, it's a change to a physical organ within the body that then has certain sorts of consequences for you. It causes symptoms. Same with flu. You have symptoms, but there's a bodily change going on here. Migraines, again, there's things about the way your brain is functioning that's causing them. Measles, I never remember what measles does to you, as we talked about in the concepts lesson. But asthma, again, it's something about the way your lungs are and the way you respond to certain types of external criteria, but you can point to it in the body. Now, with mental illnesses, why does this sort of characterization not work? Well, what is the worry here? Why is it that we can't just say, well, it's just a change in a certain sort of organ?
There's no physical examination that can be done to pinpoint. It's unfortunately theories with examining symptoms and trying to diagnose and classify.
Yeah, so here's the major issue is in the case of mental disorders, it's a disorder of the mind. That is like the characteristic definition of what a mental disorder is. It is disorder or illness of the mind. And what did we say the mind was earlier? Well, it's not like a physical thing. We took on the possibility of the mind being just the same as the brain and the body in eliminative materialism, and we saw there are problems with that. Instead, we're thinking of the mind as this something like what folk psychology says. It's this thing that is responsible for what we do and believe and feel. So what would it even mean to have an illness with a physical thing or a non-physical thing? We know it is for a physical thing. Here's an organ, it's not working right. A mind, though, a mind is a mind. You can't like point to the cancerous growths in the mind. You can't point to these sorts of things. It's complicated. So instead, what we end up doing is instead of looking at the symptoms to find the underlying cause, what often ends up happening is that people just start defining these things in terms of what the symptoms are. And on the one hand, that can be very useful because these symptoms can cluster together in ways that are predictable. So for instance, if you know a person has extreme difficulty with motivation and is having trouble getting off the couch and is feeling worthless, well, those characteristics often go hand in hand. So it can be useful to describe it in terms of depression. But unlike in a case where you could say, well, headache and trouble breathing and fever, well, that's a sign of something going on underneath. There's this thing, COVID, and these are the symptoms of COVID. Over here, what ends up happening is, as Grace said, it just ends up kind of describing the symptoms together as a unit. And now, that's not to say these symptoms aren't real and they're not genuine and they're not organized in they can be organized in law-like ways and have certain sorts of causes. It's somewhat different than what's going on over in these other cases. And because of that, it can be much more difficult to treat the things that we label as mental illnesses, COVID, you get a vaccine. There's no vaccine for PTSD. You can't just give someone a shot and make sure they never get PTSD. You can do things to help people out, but it's not straightforward and it's not simple. So everyone, just that first glance of why it's difficult. We talk about them both as illnesses, but there's this important difference between them. Everyone on board with that? So there is within psychology, and especially a strain within psychiatry, of people who want to say that because when we look at, there's no mind organ, there's just physical organs. They want to say that mental disorders or mental illnesses, or the things we typically call mental illnesses, are not really mental illnesses. What are they? Well, if we're going to be true to the illness part, it can't be of the mind, it has to be an illness of something else. So what would this strain, it's generally called the medical model of mental illness. What do they say is actually the cause of what we typically call mental illness or mental disease? Any guesses? They're going to say there is no mind that can be diseased, only parts of the body can be diseased. So if we're seeing something that we typically call a mental disease, what's really going on?
Neurotransmitter like deficiencies or portions of the brain that are malfunctioning.
It's going to be neuroscientific. So basically it's going to be, there's no mental illnesses, there are brain illnesses and nervous system illnesses. And what we find when we consider this is that when you look at individual cases, a lot of them, and part of the reason that why it's so hard to define mental illness or mental disorder is a lot of the things that we talk of as mental illnesses and mental disorders do seem to be able to be explained in terms of defects in the brain or defects in the nervous system, or at the very least, it's something about the brain. And what we talk of as this mental illness is really just a symptom of a damaged brain. And so to give a couple examples, and so the reasoning behind this model is basically, well, we see some cases in which this works, so why not think it works in every single case? At the end, we'll talk, or in a few minutes, we'll talk about why that doesn't seem to work perfectly. But does anyone have taken an abnormal psych class or know some of these things where there are cases in which we find that what we would typically call a mental disorder really just seems to be a brain problem, like straightforwardly?
So dementia.
So dementia is one. So dementia of various types. So how many people are NFL football fans or been following all the stuff with the CTE and NFL players?
Yeah, the brain injuries, and they were taking out their brains after they died to examine and noticing that the hits from their head.
Yeah, it's basically a lot of these guys who, like, after the NFL end up dying young or committing suicide. What they do is they look at their brains after they played, and what they find is basically there are just gigantic holes in their brain. Like, instead of having a brain that's shaped something like this, their brain is shaped something like this, where that is just empty space because the cells have died. And so in this sort of case, we think of dementia as a mental illness. But maybe what it is in a case of dementia, you can just say, like, oh, this is just a physical breakdown of the brain. So in some cases, yeah, they've also been able to diagnose this in living people recently. And so these are cases in which what we describe as a mental disorder or mental illness starts to look like it's just a breakdown, or it's really just, what we're talking about is, no, this is just brain damage. This is a brain injury. There are some other things like this. So this is an example that I think is super cool and weird and interesting. So let me make sure I write down the name right. Temporal lobe focal epilepsy. So temporal lobe focal focal epilepsy. If this is a human brain, whoopsie board, stay where you are. If here's the brain, this little bit down here is the temporal lobe. And what they found is if you have a particular type of, usually it's a very, very small calcified growth. So basically shit can grow on your brain. That's just the way it works. Sometimes it's a terrible tumor. Other times it can just be a tiny random sort of little growth. And these little growths are generally about 1/10 the size of your pinky nail. So we're talking something very small, but if it's in the right place, what it can do is cause you to have this type of epilepsy. Now, what is epilepsy? It's just like excessive energy firing in the brain. So like a global epileptic fit will cause someone to have a seizure. But what this temporal lobe epilepsy does is incredibly bizarre. And basically what it can do is every once in a while, when one of these seizures happens, it's not the same for everybody, but it has been documented as causing people for about a day just to start acting in incredibly antisocial ways and doing things like carrying out all of the steps needed to kill someone. They will just, there was a case in which somebody went to the University of Texas campus with a firearm and just started shooting at people from a high building. Now, this will last a few hours, 24 hours, and looking from the outside, this looks like a totally normal, like, I mean, it seems like someone who's clearly not right in the head, but it's got all the symptoms of somebody who is acting under their own volition. They will do things like go to the store to buy the gun to shoot the people. Then the next day, you'll ask them, what were you doing yesterday? And they will have no memory of it at all. Completely blank spot in their brain. If you remove this little tiny thing here, these episodes completely stop. Just remove, go into their brain, do brain surgery, remove the tiny 1/10 of your fingernail size growth, and this person will stop going on murderous rampages. So here's another case in which what it looks like is, well, this is clearly some sort of mental illness or mental disorder, somebody who goes on murderous rampages. But then we look more closely and it's like, well, maybe this is just a brain disorder. This is just somebody with a growth. They weren't the ones acting in this case. It was just that their brain was not operating in the correct way. Other things that seem to suggest the mental model to some degree are just things like medication, physical medication can work in certain cases. And we've also even been able to identify to some degree what sorts of neurotransmitters are associated with different types of mental illnesses. So everyone from their intro psych class or from anything else, what is a neurotransmitter? Anyone, just so we know what we're talking about here?
It's a messenger.
Yeah, it's a messenger. And what is it a messenger of?
Any different communication between neurons for what you see, what you feel, sensations to operate.
It's basically the main way we communicate is on electrical pathways between neurons, which looks something like this. But the issue is neurons don't touch each other directly. Instead, there are little gaps between them. And across the gaps, they basically send a tiny little chemical messenger from one neuron to the next. So it'll be like, we just had a signal, go. And so they've basically been able to identify that certain neurotransmitters are associated with different types of mental activity. So for instance, dopamine is the neurotransmitter that is associated both with Parkinson's, and it's also, when like that feeling of you just opened up your your favorite stupid phone game and you beat a level on your favorite stupid phone game and you just have that feeling of like I did it. That's dopamine being released. So like increased dopamine is associated with these sorts of feelings. So they've been able to find some things in these sorts of cases. However, there are some major issues with thinking that every single mental illness can be defined in terms of damage to the brain. can anyone think off the top of their head what just like some of the potential issues are with thinking that everything's just a matter of brain issues?
Depression, like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Depression is a classic case. To the best of our knowledge, there are some causal connections between depression and things like serotonin levels. But also, it doesn't seem first off, no one quite even understands why different people respond to different. So SSRIs are the main sort of medicine that is given to depressed people, and what it does is basically increase how much serotonin gets sent across or gets picked up by the next nerve. So, or the next neuron. So here's a neuron, it's shaped like this. And here's the neuron coming this way, and it gets here and it releases a neurotransmitter. Any ones that get picked up stay there, but sometimes they don't get picked up and they'll tend to bounce back. And what these drugs do is basically put a shield here that forces them to keep bouncing until they get picked up. So we know generally that somehow helps to some degree, but we don't know why some people respond to SSRIs better than others, why some people don't respond at all, why some people respond to certain medicines but not other medicines. And no psychologist I know believes that these are going to cure depression. Rather, what they can do is help someone get into a mindset such they can then approach the depression or the anxiety in other ways. So if it were really, now someone who likes the medical model might just say, we don't know enough yet to explain the brain problems, but it seems like depression is just such a general sort of thing that is it manifests so differently in different people that it seems like it's not the sort of thing that lends itself to a medical model. Another issue is, now there are people who have an incredibly close mind-body connection who are able to, this sort of stuff is like very difficult to test, but there are instances in which people have been like, I was able to get over this disease faster because I wanted to get over it faster. But in most cases, most people are not able to get over a physical illness just by thinking about it hard, or by doing something like thinking back to their childhood memories and thinking about how their mother treated them on their birthday when they were 4. And yet thinking about things like that can help in cases like depression. So it seems like, yeah, so Govindra says placebo effect. And so there is, the placebo effect is another classic case in which the mind can seem to have an effect on the body. So the placebo effect is a case in which you give someone something that they think is medicine, but isn't really medicine. And sometimes what happens is just by thinking it's medicine, you'll start to feel a little bit better. So yeah, the placebo effect is another case of the mind affecting the body. But outside of these, but it's never like you can get someone to go from like super, like if you break your leg, you can't just think about it and make your leg suddenly heal. But you can maybe speed it up a little bit if you like put the effort in. But it's far more likely to get help if you set it right and go to the doctor. But with mental illnesses, it seems like thinking or talking to people or interacting can really help in a lot of cases. And so if it were all medical, if it were just brain problems, this fact would be really, really hard to explain. Why on earth would therapy be at all helpful to anyone if what the problem is just a brain problem? Let's see. So it looks like a lot. So there are certain of these mental illnesses or mental disorders that we point to that we can say straightforwardly, like maybe what we're talking about here is just a mental symptom of a brain defect. However, it looks like there are lots of others that seem to be something else. Something else is going on here. Depression, anorexia, bulimia. It doesn't seem like these are the sorts of things that you just say, well, that person's missing this part of this brain. Or PTSD. It's not that the soldier had their brain part blown off. It's rather that something about the experience changed their thinking in a way that is disordered or counts as an illness. Marie.
Could it be argued then though that like some of the illnesses that you can see like manifesting mentally are not like through experiences? So because like, I feel like the ones through that have happened through experiences like PTSD or like eating disorders are like societal things that have caused trauma rather than like being like a mental thing.
So I think that's a really good point. And one thing to do here is just, we've got this big long list, and what you can start to do is tease them apart and say some of these just seem to be physical ailments, while others seem much more tied into experience. And as Marie said, there are some that seem entirely tied in with experience. However, there are some complications here, such as the fact that like there are it's a good way of teasing them apart. And so I'm not dismissing this point because I think it's a great one. And I think if we are going to get a good understanding of mental illnesses and mental disorders, it does seem like a case in which you can separate the ones that seem not in any way having anything to do with personal experience or personal history from those that involve it in some ways. But the tough thing is there's still going to be a gray area. So what we end up with is like the purely physical on one side, the purely behavioral or purely physical, purely historical. But then we have things like schizophrenia, where there's a very strong biological or genetic component to schizophrenia, by which I mean that if your parents have schizophrenia, you are far more likely to get it than somebody else. However, it's not a guarantee, and it does seem like things like schizophrenia need to have environmental history things set it off. Same with depression, where if you have come from a family of people, or addiction is another one. If you come from a family of people with an alcohol addiction, the odds that you will one day become an alcoholic are on average going to be higher than somebody with no history of alcoholism. However, that's not a guarantee that you will. And I think Raven's right. This sort of case is kind of a signal of, this is showing that we can't go full, like if we're going to understand mental illness and mental disorders, folk psychology alone is not going to be able to explain certain cases like the dementia from football injuries or this temporal lobe focal epilepsy. However, if we go with a pure neuroscience approach, we also seem to have a problem. We can't explain things like depression, bulimia, anxiety straightforwardly in terms of brain damage or brain problems. All right, so if we're not going to say that mental illnesses can just be defined in terms of brain issues, what then is a mental illness? How do we define a mental illness if it's not just a physical illness? So when a psychologist decides on this, like if you were to go into a mental hospital and be like, I think I have a mental problem, please diagnose me with my mental problem, please tell me what my mental illness is. Anyone know how the psychologist is going to go about doing this?
They refer to the DSM-5 and try and diagnose you.
Yep, that's exactly what happens. The DSM, and we're now up to the 5th. I can never remember exactly what it stands for. The Diagnostic and Symptom Manual or something like that. It's the, let's see, where are we? I know it's on the first page of the article. I don't want to screw this up. But yeah, basically what they do is they look in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, Volume 5. You get there, and basically it's just a big fat book that has a whole bunch of different types of diseases and disorders and how each of them are defined. And then they compare your symptoms with what's in the DSM-5. That's generally how you get diagnosed. And according to the DSM-5, there are basically, they define it as 4 characteristics that go into what a mental disorder or mental illness is. This was in the reading. I'm gonna combine them into 3. But basically, the way the DSM-5 defines what a mental disorder or mental illness is it is a behavioral behavioral or psychological pattern that occurs in a person and A, causes distress or impairs them. B, is not an expected response. And C, not culturally sanctioned but not just political disagreement. So the way the DSM defines what a mental illness is, it's a behavioral or psychological pattern that occurs in a person that causes that person distress or impairs them in some way, is not an expected response to an ordinary life event, and is not culturally sanctioned by the society, is not something that is deemed okay, but is not deemed okay simply because of the fact that the government wants to control you. So, for instance, the Soviet Union would just accuse political dissidents of being insane to lock them up. So not counting those. So that's how it defines it. But what we find is this is the definition that's literally in the book that psychologists use. But the more you look at this definition, or I guess the moment you start looking at it closely, you start to realize that there's a lot of potential issues in each of these sorts of conditions. And what you find is, while we have this understanding of what each of these, like we know what bulimia is, we know what anorexia is, it's hard to say what sorts of things count as a disease and what sorts of things don't count as a disease. So for instance, causes distress or impairs them. This is incredibly vague. Why do I say this is vague? A behavioral or psychological pattern that occurs in a person and causes distress. Well,
This could be, it could be physical too, or not necessarily only mental.
yeah, so part of the thing is the distress could be physical distress, but there's also, I think, this issue of like, first off, how much counts as impairing? For instance, you're shy. Say you're just a shy person who doesn't like talking in class, and some of your teachers give you low participation grades just because you're shy. Does that count as a mental disorder on this? How much impairing counts as impairment? How much distress counts as distressing? Like if I don't like cats, I just find them mildly ugly and annoying. Does that mean I'm, I have a disease, I have a mental disorder of cat hatred? It seems like, no, it seems like there has to be more, but where to draw the line is not in any way simple. So does everyone see where even right here, first glance, causes distress or impairment? In some sense, you clearly need this because if somebody didn't mind the way they were, we'd be hard pressed to say that they were, people go, if you're sad, you don't necessarily go to a therapist. It's only when your levels of depression are causing you distress or really getting in the way of your everyday life. Or if your drinking is preventing you from meeting appointments, then you start to worry about it. All right, is not an expected let's actually go to number C first. I find C more interesting. What's the worry with defining mental illness as a sort of behavior that's not culturally sanctioned? What's the worry here?
Cultural values aren't stable.
Yeah, cultural values aren't stable and change. This is kind of one of the main ways we seem to decide whether someone is has a mental disorder is we begin as a society by going, well, we must be sane. I know I'm not crazy. If everyone else can't hear the voices, that's just they don't have good enough ears. So if everyone else is, on board, then and everyone else is feeling the way I am, then it seems like, well, the other people, anyone who is different from us, must be crazy or must be insane. And so what you end up with in these cases is that we start defining what counts as having an illness or disorder, not in the medical sense in which there's just a breakdown or a problem with a physical organ, but simply based on the fact that somebody behaves in a way that is different from everyone else in their culture, which also means that cultures are going to have very, very different types of what counts as a disorder or not. So, Devendra, did you want to say something?
No, I'm good.
Okay, I thought I cut you off. All right. So yeah, so what are some examples here in which this is going to become problematic? Cases in which we're going to point to someone, because we like to think of diseases and disorders as things that are like the same universally. Like measles is the same for every human being. Like everyone gets measles and it's the same virus, etc. COVID, it's across the whole world right now. It's not like if you have different child rearing practices, COVID is going to be a different disease. And yet in mental disease and mental disorder, we start to run into these problems where you start to accuse people of being diseased just because they don't think in the same way you do. So can anyone think of an example of a case, either cross individuals or cross culturally, in which we're going to start seeing things? That's one of the biggest ones in history is homosexuality. Marie, did you have?
Probably additional Russian people to alcohol. Like it's okay for Russian people just to drink like 1 beer every day, but it seems like you seem to be addicted person in the United States if you drink so.
So things like, so with C, I'm gonna put it over here. We've got cases of like drinking, homosexuality. Anyone have other ones? Marie, did you have one?
No, I was gonna say one that's kind of more like political, but like in the 60s, like communism was seen as something that was mental.
Yeah, so something like communism or anti-Americanism or lack of patriotism can start to be defined as a mental illness. If everyone around you is a strong believer that America's the best and can do nothing wrong, then by this step, and if you are distressed by the fact that you don't love America and you think there's a lot of problems with it, and when the US wins in an Olympic gold medal, you just don't give a damn, and you are the only person in your society, then you start to worry like, now disliking America or having communist tendencies starts to be a mental disorder. And Govindra brings up this point. It starts to look like, well, in this case, then aren't we like defining our society as maybe society is disordered and you're normal, but what would that mean? So it seems like we're starting to define what counts as being diseased or being ill simply in terms of what's common. And homosexuality is perhaps historically the biggest or clearest example of this. Up until the DSM-3, the first two DSMs counted homosexuality as a mental illness that you should be treated for. You should go to a doctor to try to cure you of your homosexuality. Why was it the case this way? Well, because it was deemed that it was a culturally sanctioned sort of issue where, your society says it's bad and it causes you distress that you aren't attracted to who the society tells you you're supposed to be. So therefore, you have a mental illness. Now, we don't consider homosexuality as an illness. So there's this strange thing where what we want to say, like the intuitive judgment is homosexuality was never an illness. it was never an illness because it's not a disorder or a disease. What it is people who are just, have different sexual preferences. However, on the DSM definition, it looks like if you live in a society in which homosexuality is frowned upon, then being homosexual counts as a mental illness that you need to go to a doctor for, which again, doesn't seem like something that we want to say, and yet seems to be spit out by this definition. The DSM has since removed it, but it seems like they've removed it in many ways just because of the common sense realization that homosexuality isn't a disease, not because their definition doesn't include it. Raven brings up drug use. That's another one. So drugs and drinking. What counts as an appropriate amount to people brings up transgender was until, so let's bring up transgender. All right, so drinking and drug use were considered, there are major cultural differences on this. In certain societies, if you do not drink a certain level of alcohol, you are weird. If you don't partake in certain types of, like to go with classical cases, if you didn't partake in certain types of feasts, you were like an outsider who was deemed having a mental disorder. Something as simple as where you're from is going to determine how much alcohol is acceptable. If you are from a society where the religious laws dictate that you should not drink at all, then you drink one alcoholic beverage a week and you have a major problem. If you're from somewhere where it's fucking freezing in winter and it's dark all the time and you don't drink large amounts of alcohol, well then, you're then the weird one for not drinking. Transgender is another classic one where until last year, it was considered a mental illness by the World Health Organization. Well, now the fight here is people who are saying that anyone who is transgendered is an abnormal person with some sort of mental illness or disorder because they are unlike most people. And yet on the flip side, the push is the only reason that we think they're not like us is just because of these historical trends. Other things like, if you were to take a citizen of many ancient cultures and drop them into modern society, we consider them a homicidal maniac immediately. People would go and watch other humans torture and kill each other. And yet here we are just like, back in ancient Rome, we get to watch people die and we do it for fun. You bring that sort of person here and it's like, wait, they are a psychopath. That person is absolutely mentally insane. They need help. So again, what counts as normal is going to change across society. So there's there's both a practical and a theoretical issue here. The practical problem is one of the reasons it's now going to be incredibly difficult. You're not going to be able to diagnose people as having an illness or disorder except by comparing them to their whole society. Because in that case, what counts as normal is different. So whether or not some particular person counts as having a mental disorder, you're going to have to learn what their society is like before you can do that. But a more theoretical issue is clearly mental distress and clearly sorts of individual differences in terms of ability to function in the world and the pain functioning in the world causes. Clearly, those are real things. But do we really think it's appropriate to use terms like illness and disorder if it's changing across cultures? On the one hand, most diseases don't change across cultures, but on the other hand, clearly these sorts of things like depression and mental illness, other sorts of mental illnesses aren't just things where you say toughen up. Like clearly there's more going on here, but is it the sort of more going on that illness and disorder are really the correct sorts of terms? And it's really, really messy to try to decide these things. Any questions or comments on up to this point?
Also, for a comment, like different mental illnesses manifest different across cultures. Depression manifests differently amongst like American culture or across like Asian culture or any other culture, and how they, defined and what is acceptable.
That's a really great point, Grace. One thing is just so things like how a person behaves, like what counts as depression is going to depend on what society you're in, just because people behave differently. But there are also issues where certain types of things that we would say are mental illnesses are not considered illnesses, but are considered positive things in other cultures. So there are cases of things, Marie, I just saw your hand up.
Yeah, I feel like as we were talking about depression, also made me think of like how people talk about seasonal depression and like the blurry lines there.
Yeah, and that's another thing, like, is it really that you have, so for instance, I would be willing to bet that worldwide, the alcohol consumption of human beings increased rather markedly during COVID. Do we want to say now that a higher percentage of the population has an alcohol problem, or do we just want to say people are locked inside all the time and there's nothing to do and therefore they're resorting to alcohol? Or, as Marie said, seasonal affective disorder. People generally get a little bit less happy in winter. Do we want to say that this person has a, if you get really depressed in winter, do we really want to say that's an illness? Or do we just want to say, like, no, you're programmed biologically not to like the darkness and feel good in it and to miss the sunlight? But there's also things like hearing voices. At times in history, in certain cultures, hearing voices, what would they do? Nowadays, you hear a lot of voices. What does a person typically do? We find out that your child is hearing voices of the people in the walls. What is our tendency in our current United States 21st century culture?
Get help for them.
Yeah, get help for them. In ancient times, depending on the society, anyone have any ideas what they might do with them?
We'll call them an oracle.
Yeah, they call them an oracle. They give them a privileged place, and they let the voices they hear dictate what the tribe or the group does. So depending on what society you're in, so not only is it that a disease like depression or major anxiety is going to manifest differently in different cultures to such a degree that do we want to say it's the same disease or different? It's also the case that the very same symptoms are getting treated completely differently depending on the society you're in. Here's the last one, not an expected response. And this kind of goes back to, I think it was your point, Govindra. Yeah, maybe our culture is the thing in disorder. And here's just a final thing, is in a lot of cases, the things that are causing us distress and impairing our everyday lives seem to be not in any way abnormal responses to the sorts of situations that we're put in. Like, human beings are not, in some sense, designed to stand in front of large groups of people and recite things and then be judged for it on the internet. We are not designed to talk to each other without seeing another person's face. For most of human history, we could only communicate as far as we could see and hear another person. Nowadays, we can have millions of people sending us mean messages from anywhere around the world without even knowing what they're looking like. So is something like incredible distress and depression brought on by reading your Twitter mentions, is that really a sign that you have a mental illness, that you're depressed? Or is that a sign that you are in a society that is not designed for your brain? So what counts as expected response is itself somewhat difficult to define. So does everyone understand that this last point, that even something as simple as like, we know that it's not depression if your dad dies and you get sad, no one wants to say you have a mental illness, that's a normal response. But it seems like the sorts of responses we have to things and the sorts of addictions we have can be kind of explained. They are, in some sense, the expected response. It's almost like, as Govindra said, the society or the culture can be ordered in such a way that to live in that culture is to behave in a way that is so distressful or distress-causing that it seems almost like an illness. So there was this famous, actually, it's not as well discussed, and I cannot remember who did it, but it's one of my favorite studies. It was a study on substance abuse. And basically what they were doing was trying to discover whether addictions to things like heroin are like a biological thing or whether there are like psychological components that lead one to be more inclined towards addiction. And what they did is essentially they got a bunch of rats, they stuck them in cages, they put them, like the rat was put in a little cage that looked like this. You know, it's just a tiny little boring rat cage. And then they laced the rat's water dish with heroin. So if the rat's here in the cage, anyone guess what the rat started doing? So here's the rat. It's in this boring little cage. Here's its heroin water.
I remember this study. Of course, they would go for the heroin and they would become physically addicted.
Yeah. These little rats would basically just become little rat heroin addicts. They're in this tiny little cage. There's water there. They started taking it. Govindra, do you want to say what the rest of the study was?
Yeah, I believe they took the rats out of that cage and then put them in a new one that was sort of like a rat theme park, basically, that had all kinds of wheels and like stimulating activities for them to do. And then they still had the choice between the heroin water and the regular water. And they ended up rejecting the heroin water because they had a sort of, I don't know, their Maslow hierarchy of needs for the rats was fulfilled, essentially.
Which basically they gave them, an amusement park's a great way of describing it. They put the rats in a giant cage with other rats and let them play. These rats tried the heroin water once, got high, and then realized, I don't need this. I'd rather go play with my friends. So in this case, like addiction, it seems like addiction, like, yes, it's a mental illness, but in some ways, if you are bored to tears and your life has no meaning, finding meaning in something like gambling or drinking or sexual encounters is in some way what we would expect a species like us to do. So there's this very strange thing in which even something as like clear cut as addiction, which we want to say is a disorder and it can really impair your life, is in some ways an expected biological response for a species that was not designed to grow up in a society like the one we're in. So does all of that make sense to everyone? Where like, so you walk in and you're trying to get a diagnosis and it's very, very difficult to find out, like, do we count this as a disease or not? And clearly, like, and I'm in no way dismissing that people who have addictions, those addictions can cause immense amounts of distress in their lives and impair their ability to have other sorts of relationships. But at the same time, it's not that surprising that in a society in which people are worked to the bone and worried about paying for their paying for, you know, putting food on the table, of course people are going to be depressed and anxious all the time. Maria asks, is disorder and illness supposed to be synonymous? That's a great question. And I think the short answer is they get used interchangeably and not many people take the time to disentangle them. I think very often people want to speak in terms of illnesses for a very reasonable reason of, for most of human history, things like PTSD. So does anyone know what the response to PTSD was for soldiers after World War I?
This wasn't even acknowledged.
Yeah, it was basically, well, they're just fucking cowards.
Yeah.
Typical response. So the push towards calling it an illness was to say, like, this isn't just somebody's choosing this. This is a genuine sort of disease that this person does not have control over. While disorders seem to have a bit less of that strength to it. And because of that, some things end up being called disorders that other people don't necessarily want to say are an illness. So for instance, illness generally gets used for things that people say are less like immediately just fixable, and disorder is less whatever, but generally they can be used interchangeably. So yes and no, Marie. Some people, I'm using them synonymously here just to cover like the general grouping, but the reasons that they both get used are, there's some sociological effects in it for things like the fact that soldiers with PTSD used to just be told, stop being a effing fill in the blank. So any other questions on anything that's come thus far? And then I want to jump into the being sane in insane places stuff. just as a final complication to throw in. All right, well, if no questions, let's go into sane and insane places. So I'm not expecting any of you to have read this because it was officially assigned for a video on Wednesday. But is anyone familiar with this study? It was
I read this last semester. Well, actually 2 semesters ago. So it was a study where they had a few, I don't know if it was like 10 or 8 different people go try to get into a mental hospital. They weren't actually having these symptoms. They pretended to have these symptoms. And it was to see like what was accepted and how they could get out, or how they would be classified as actually being crazy, and to observe the relationships among the staff there and the doctors, along with how they acknowledge people inside the clinic.
Yeah, so there were a few different elements of this, but that's basically it. You had, I can't remember the exact numbers. I think it was 8. It was like 8 or 10 people, all of whom were either psychologists. So if the study was conducted by David Rosenhan, I want to say it was in like the 70s. And what it was is he had 8 volunteers who were all knowledgeable in psychology claim falsely that they had a mental disorder. Then what they did is they went to a mental hospital saying, and then they gave a bunch of fake symptoms, none of which lined up perfectly with an actual disease. It was just like they heard some voices and the voices were saying that they are a terrible person. So it was like took elements from schizophrenia and elements from like anxiety and depression and tried to get themselves checked into this mental hospital. So that was the basic study. And what they were really interested in is, well, how is it that we know that the main people deciding whether someone counts as sane or insane or as having a mental illness is a mental health professional. And what they were trying to tease out is, we all know clearly there are some people who have what we would call mental illnesses, mental disorders. Someone who literally like can't speak because they're so depressed, or someone who's physically harming themselves. But the question is how hard is it in these borderline cases, and how many people that we call crazy or having a mental illness should we really characterize as having a mental illness? So their goal was to go in and see how quickly the people working there in the hospital were able to identify whether this person had a mental illness. And none of them did. And the second step is once they got, so everyone was a little worried when they let them in. I think it was 8 people. Anyone guess how many of the 8 were checked into the mental hospital? How many successfully made it past the initial thing and convinced them that they were hearing voices? All of them. Yep. 8? All 8. All 8 made it in. So once they were in, they were told, now that you're in, behave completely normally. Do nothing weird. Don't show any symptoms. Just like talk to these people as if you were in your everyday life. You just happen to be in a mental hospital. And each and every one of them, what they found was they were all treated as if they were there for good reason. And none of them were dismissed as not having actually had a disease. I think they were usually diagnosed with schizophrenia, but none of them were dismissed for not really having schizophrenia. Rather, they were all dismissed for having schizophrenia in remission. So no one within the mental hospital realized that any of these people were faking it. Everybody who was in the mental hospital faking it, no one picked up on it. And what they found was that there's this incredible power of the label. And basically what happened was, as soon as this person was labeled in a certain way, the behaviors that they had started being channeled through these sorts of labels. So for instance, they were told, don't lie about your personal history once you're in there. If they ask you about your relationships with your parents and they ask you about your relationships with everything, explain to them what happened. Explain to them what really went on in your life. So they'd say things like, you know, I was close with my dad when I was young, but then as I grew older, we grew a little bit more distant. And then I got closer to my mom as I got older. And suddenly, so that's like a description that probably applies to many of us. And what ended up happening was the doctors or the aides would write down things like, has trouble maintaining close relationships. One of these people was like a psychiatrist who knew a lot on depression, decided like the regimen, so the person who was faking being a patient engaged one of the doctors because they said, hey, doctor, I think you're prescribing the wrong depression medicine. I've done a lot of work in psychiatry. I know this. And the person working in the hospital engaged with them and like talked to them, was respectful, but then as soon as they left, wrote down in the journal, like, this person has this schizophrenic has tendencies towards grandiosity and thinking of themselves as important. And so what ended up happening is when Govindra says the mental health staff were operating under confirmation bias. And this is exactly what it is. So confirmation bias is you look for evidence to confirm what you already expect. And part of the issue in this case is that what label initially gets put on someone is very, very difficult to remove once it's put on. And this is a problem for things like mental illness, where if there's a misdiagnosis early on, or because these illnesses aren't so clear cut, it can end up having these very long-term effects. And another issue that this shows is what the people in there found was that the very nature of the situation that they were in were causing them to behave in ways that the staff would identify as evidence of illness or craziness. So for instance, because they spent so much time alone, they found themselves engaging in conversation with complete strangers a lot more. Here in New York, you don't just walk up to a complete stranger and start talking to them because, well, that's like goes against the social norms somewhat. The only people who tend to just like walk up and talk to complete strangers on the street and engage them are people that we generally say, well, that person has a mental illness. So if you're working in this hospital and you see one person walking up to a complete stranger and engaging them in conversation, you look at this and go, oh, that's abnormal behavior. That is a sign of an illness. When in truth, the very nature of the hospital led to behaviors that were being easily construed as a sign of an illness. And this is kind of showing the exact same things I was saying before about, like, you know, if you're constantly in a rush to get somewhere, you're constantly on edge because at any minute you could get an email, you can't ever escape your phone, then of course you're going to be on edge. Do we really want to say that you have a mental illness, or you're just having a normal response to the fact that the modern world is overstimulating, exhausting, and not designed for a species who lived in small groups out on a savanna and spent much of the time napping? So this is really the thing with mental health. And if there's a takeaway from today, it's basically just like mental distress is real. There's clearly such a thing as an ill brain, a brain that is broken. And there's clearly cases in which somebody is like, mental health is a real thing. Like, you can be more or less mentally healthy. And also, there are clearly cases in which it's appropriate to speak of someone as having a mental illness. None of this should be dismissed. None of this should be pushed down. All of this needs to be taken into account, respected, and we need to find ways to deal with it. But just to highlight, dealing with it is very, very difficult and very hard to figure out what's going on. It's not just like a doctor for regular health stuff where the difficulty is just finding out what disease this person has, of like what virus is in their body. Rather, with mental health, it's not only finding like what it is, it's looking and trying to find, is there something wrong with the physical body? Is it rather that there are complex mental histories? Is it rather that there's just this person is a bit eccentric and doesn't go about things in the ways other people do? Is it simply that this person is in a shitty situation that is currently unpleasant and not really an illness at all that they need medication or anything else for. All they need is they need a new job that doesn't treat them like complete shit. So all of this is really the complicated stuff around mental illness, mental disorders, and why none of this stuff is easy, and why so often it can be very frustrating to go to a mental health professional. And I'm not saying it's not frustrating, but also all of this stuff is very real and it can be helpful. And it's just a matter of finding the right person and the right combination. And maybe you get a bad treatment, maybe it doesn't work well for you, but it's also not to say that just because there are these problems, your issues shouldn't be taken seriously, or that when someone says they're mentally ill, it doesn't mean that they're telling the truth because their brain is totally normal. All right, so what I'm going to talk about next week, so class is now done. If you want to get going, feel free. But next week, it's kind of going to take a similar sort of approach of, instead of looking at illness and mental illness, we're instead going to be looking at evil. And looking at what the evil is a topic that has been discussed much in the history of philosophy, especially in medieval philosophy, about things like, if God is all good, then where does evil come from? And therefore, people have to talk about what counts as evil, what isn't really evil. I mean, evil is everywhere in our fiction. There's the Dark Lord this, the Dark Lord that. You're welcome, everyone who's thanking me. Thank you all as well. But then, so we have all this evil stuff and we see terrible, evil things happening in the world. But what does the psych literature actually say about the nature of evil? Because it's a lot less clear cut than we like to think. Typically, we think of evil as something like, you're either a good person or you're a bad person. You go to the good place if you're a good person, you go to the bad place if you're a bad person. But when we actually look at the data of how people behave, we find that most of the things that people call evil are carried out by people who are not that different from you or I, and rather other things are contributing. And if this is right, and it's not people that are evil, but just situations that cause people to act in evil ways and situations that cause people to act in good ways, what are the implications of that? What does this mean for things like the law? What does this mean for things like, I like you because you're a good person? Does that just really mean that you like this person because they grew up in a nice environment? So this is more what we're going to be talking about next time. Any other questions, comments, concerns, feelings, thoughts, anything? I'm going to stop the recording. If anyone wants to stick around and ask any more questions, feel free. Give me one sec. Correct.